The heavy mahogany boardroom table shook as Richard Sterling slammed his palm down, violently ripping a thick legal document in half and scattering the shredded pieces across the floor. He glared at the young man sitting quietly in a worn jacket, his face twisted in pure arrogance. A black man from a broken, penniless neighborhood like you doesn't have the right to touch a single penny of our family's legacy? Richard sneered, tossing a broken pen directly at his chest. Look at your skin. Look at those cheap clothes. You belong under a warehouse floor, not sitting in a boardroom pretending to be our equal. You're nothing but a street swindler who targeted a vulnerable old woman, and I will make sure you rot in a federal cell for this. Meredith, Richard's wife, let out a sharp, mocking laugh as she leaned forward, crossing her arms. Did you honestly think a $20 welfare scam would buy your way into high society, sweetie? People like you are a disease to neighborhoods like this, and it's deeply insulting that we even have to breathe the same air as you while you try to steal what we worked our entire lives to inherit. The corporate board members sat frozen, but the chief attorney slowly stood up, pulled a certified backup copy of the estate amendment from his briefcase, and cleared his throat. The greedy heirs had no idea that a single crinkled $20 bill passed between strangers in a freezing storm hours earlier was about to strip them of everything. Don't miss a single second of this incredible journey of justice and truth. Tell us your current city and local time in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button right now to join our community. The rhythm of the South Side of Chicago did not care about a man's exhaustion, and Marcus Vance knew this truth down to his very bones. At 29 years old, Marcus measured his life, not in years, but in the physical weight of cardboard crates and the relentless ticking of the warehouse clock at Oak Ridge Logistics. For 5 years, he had been the first to arrive at the cold, cavernous distribution hub and the last to leave, operating the heavy machinery and maintaining the inventory databases with a flawless precision that kept the entire regional supply chain alive. His skin was the color of deep espresso. His hands were calloused from coarse wooden pallets, and his shoulders carried the quiet, invisible burden of a man who was the sole provider for his family. Marcus did not complain. He simply worked, fueled by the memory of his late mother and the fragile heartbeat of his 72-year-old grandmother, Evelyn, who was currently fighting severe Stage 3 diabetic complications in their cramped rental apartment on 79th Street. For the past 14 months, Marcus had poured his soul into qualifying for the vacant position of Senior Inventory Director. He had studied the logistics manuals late into the night under the dim hum of a single kitchen light, mastering the complex software systems until he could optimize a transport route in his sleep. The promotion came with a significant salary increase money that would permanently secure his grandmother's expensive monthly insulin and replace the broken radiator in their freezing living room. Marcus had successfully passed every corporate assessment with the highest scores in the company's regional history. He knew he deserved it. The entire warehouse floor knew he deserved it. But on this particular Friday morning, the air inside the glass executive offices on the upper deck felt distinctly hostile. Regional Manager Bradley Cooper, a man whose tailored gray suits could not hide the permanent sneer of unearned privilege, called Marcus into the main office. Sitting in the leather chair beside Bradley was a soft-featured, arrogant 24-year-old named Tyler Bradley's biological nephew, who had dropped out of community college twice and had never spent a single hour on a warehouse floor. "Sit down, Vance," Bradley said without looking up from his tablet, his voice dripping with an icy, casual indifference. He slid a crisp white document across the desk. "I need you to sign this transition protocol immediately. Effective Monday morning, Tyler will be taking over the role of Senior Inventory Director. As the veteran logistics technician, your new directive is to spend the next 2 weeks personally training him on our software, overseeing his entry data, and signing off on his regional reports." Marcus felt the blood in his veins turn to liquid ice. His chest tightened, the room momentarily blurring around the edges as the raw injustice of the words pierced through his dignity. "Mr. Cooper, with all due respect, I don't understand," Marcus said. keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will, though his fists clenched tightly inside his pockets. I scored a perfect 98 on the corporate operational board exams. I haven't missed a single shift in 5 years, and I built the entire tracking system Tyler is sitting next to. Tyler doesn't even have a basic certification in supply chain mechanics. Bradley Cooper slowly leaned back in his executive chair, folding his hands over his stomach as a dark, mocking smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. He looked Marcus up and down, his eyes lingering on the faded fabric of Marcus's work jacket and the dark color of his skin with an unmistakable expression of deep-seated contempt. "Let's be completely realistic here, Marcus," Bradley sneered, lowering his voice so it hissed through the quiet office. "A black man from a broken, penniless neighborhood like yours should just be grateful to have a steady, hourly check at a reputable company like Oak Ridge. You don't have the background, the pedigree, or the look for an executive corporate title. People from your side of the city are built for manual labor under the hum floor. You belong in the aisles, moving crates, not sitting in an air-conditioned office pretending you can manage a corporate budget. Now, sign the transition papers, stand next to my nephew, and show him exactly how to run the system you built. If you don't like it, you can pack your locker and see how fast your grandmother survives without our basic hourly health insurance plan." Tyler let out a quiet, insulting chuckle, spinning his leather chair around as if the entire interaction was nothing more than an amusing morning performance. Marcus stood completely frozen, the air in his lungs feeling like broken glass. Every instinct inside him screamed to shout, to slam his hand on the desk, to demand the basic human respect he had earned through years of sweat and flawless service. But he looked through the glass window at the rain starting to lash against the warehouse roof, and he thought of his grandmother Evelyn waiting for her medication. He swallowed the bitter, burning humiliation, reached forward with a trembling hand, and signed his name on the line, cementing his own subordination to an incompetent boy. By the time 9:00 p.m. arrived, the Friday shift had bled into a brutal, exhausting nightmare. Marcus had spent 12 straight hours standing on the concrete floor, swallowed by the agonizing task of explaining basic logistical concepts to a smug, distracted supervisor who spent more time texting on his phone than listening. His body ached, his mind was completely numb, and the psychological weight of the racial slurs hidden behind Bradley's corporate vocabulary pressed down on his chest like a lead weight. He walked into the locker room, his hands shaking as he pulled out his worn leather wallet to check his finances. It was a bleak, terrifying sight. After paying the skyrocketing landlord fee to avoid eviction and purchasing Evelyn's premium long-acting insulin needles from the local pharmacy, Marcus Vance was down to his absolute last $20 bill, a single crumpled green piece of paper with a torn edge. It was the only money he had left to buy groceries for himself and his grandmother for the entire upcoming weekend. There was no savings account, no safety net, and no credit line. As he stepped out of the warehouse doors, a historic Midwestern winter storm had officially broken over the city. The wind was a roaring beast, whipping a mixture of freezing rain and heavy, blinding slush through the dark alleyways of the industrial district. The temperature was dropping rapidly past the freezing point, turning the concrete sidewalks into treacherous sheets of black ice. Wrapping his thin cotton jacket tightly around his frame, Marcus began the long, shivering walk toward the public transportation line, his boots soaking through with freezing water, completely unaware that his entire universe was about to collide with a stranger in the dark. The freezing rain fell in heavy, rhythmic sheets, casting long, fractured shadows across the desolate concrete of 4th Street. It was nearly 9:45 p.m., and the industrial corridor of the city had completely emptied of its daytime workforce, leaving behind nothing but the eerie hum of flickering amber streetlights and the bitter roar of the wind. Marcus Vance walked with his head cast down, his eyes focused on the slick pavement beneath his boots as he tried to shield his face from the icy needles of water piercing through the night air. His entire body was shivering violently, the thin fabric of his old work jacket completely useless against the dropping temperature. Every muscle in his legs throbbed with agony from the 12-hour warehouse shift, but his mind remained entirely trapped in the suffocating memory of Bradley Cooper's venomous words. "You belong under the floor. Look at your skin." The humiliation burned hotter than the physical cold freezing his skin. As Marcus approached the bleak, rusted metal structure of the public bus stop near the intersection of 4th and Elm, he stopped dead in his tracks. The tiny shelter was completely open to the elements, its glass panels shattered long ago and replaced by rusted iron mesh. Sitting on the center of the wet, frozen metal bench was an elderly white woman. She looked to be in her early 70s, her skin pale and translucent under the harsh orange glow of the street lamp. She wore a classic, heavy gray wool coat that had become entirely soaked through with freezing rain, the expensive fabric clinging to her frail, trembling shoulders like a heavy shroud. Her silver hair was plastered wildly against her forehead, and her breath emerged in short, shallow, erratic puffs of white mist. She was staring straight ahead into the dark, swirling storm with wide, completely vacant eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the freezing bench so hard her knuckles were raw. She was visibly disoriented, shivering so violently that her teeth clicked together in a terrifying, rhythmic chatter. She looked like a ghost that had wandered out of a memory and gotten trapped in a nightmare. Marcus paused, his protective instincts instantly overriding his own exhaustion. He looked around the desolate street, hoping to see a family member, a police cruiser, or anyone who could explain why a frail, elderly woman was sitting alone in a life-threatening winter storm. But the street remained completely empty, save for the occasional luxury vehicle speeding down the nearby avenue, their tires kicking up dirty sheets of slush onto the sidewalk. Just then, a sleek, expensive black Mercedes SUV slowed down as it approached the intersection. Inside the vehicle, the warm, golden glow of the dashboard illuminated a wealthy, middle-aged couple dressed in high-end winter furs. For a brief second, Marcus felt a surge of hope, believing they were stopping to help. Instead, the driver lowered the tinted window by a mere 2 inches. The man looked at the shivering old woman on the bench, then cast a sharp, deeply disgusted look at Marcus, standing nearby in his faded jacket and dark skin. "Look at this garbage," the wealthy driver scoffed loudly to his wife, his voice carrying clearly over the howling wind. "Just another senile street beggar, ruining the neighborhood aesthetic and trying to run a scam in the rain. And look at the thug hovering around her. Let's get out of here before they try to jump the car or ask for a handout." The woman in the passenger seat rolled her eyes in agreement, letting out a sharp, dismissive sigh as she turned her head away. "It's honestly disgusting how the city lets people like that loiter around the public transits," she murmured, her voice dripping with practiced contempt. "They probably don't even work. They just wait for hardworking citizens to pass by so they can play the victim." With a loud roar of the engine, the Mercedes accelerated fiercely, intentionally splashing a massive wave of freezing, muddy water directly onto the sidewalk, soaking the bottom of the elderly woman's coat and Marcus's boots. Marcus let out a slow, heavy breath, his jaw tightening as the casual cruelty of the wealthy strangers left a bitter taste in his mouth. He did not care what they thought of him. He was used to being invisible or feared by people in luxury cars. But the utter lack of empathy for a freezing human being made his blood boil. He ignored the wet slush on his trousers and stepped directly into the shelter, kneeling carefully on the wet concrete in front of the elderly woman so as not to startle her. "Excuse me, ma'am?" Marcus said gently, his deep voice intentionally soft and calm, trying to cut through the terrifying roar of the wind. "Are you all right? My name is Marcus. It's freezing out here, and you're completely soaked through. Do you have someone I can call for you?" The elderly woman, Eleanor Sterling, slowly turned her head toward him. Her sharp blue eyes were bloodshot and clouded with confusion, staring at his face for a long, agonizing moment before she could manage to speak. Her voice was nothing more than a frail, broken whisper that trembled uncontrollably. My phone, she gasped, her pale lips barely moving. It went dark. The screen just went black. I was walking. I took a wrong turn from the historic district. And then, my purse. A young man ran past and snatched it from my shoulder. Everything was inside. My identification, my cards, my medicine. I tried to ask for help, but nobody would stop. I don't know how to get back, young man. I'm so cold. I can't feel my feet anymore. As she spoke, she lifted her left hand slightly to brush a wet strand of hair from her eyes, and Marcus froze in absolute astonishment. There, resting prominently on her ring finger, was a massive, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring, surrounded by a halo of brilliant platinum that caught the flickering amber street lamp and blazed with an almost blinding ethereal light. It was a spectacular, museum-grade piece of jewelry, easily worth over $200,000 a fortune that could buy an entire block of houses in Marcus's neighborhood. It was a completely surreal, glaring contradiction. Here was an elderly woman sitting on a rusted, broken bench in a dangerous inner-city corridor, completely destitute, starving, and on the verge of hypothermia, yet she was openly wearing a fortune on her hand. In this neighborhood, displaying something that valuable in the dead of night was an open invitation to extreme violence. Yet, miraculously, no one had stolen it, and she seemed completely oblivious to its presence, too consumed by the freezing agony of the storm to realize she was holding a golden ticket. Marcus stared at the blazing stone for a split second, realizing the immense danger she was in, and knew he could not leave her side for even a single minute. The reality of the situation settled over Marcus like a physical weight. The elderly woman's skin was taking on a dangerous, bluish tint under the amber streetlights, and her shivering was starting to slow down, a critical medical sign that her body was losing its battle against hypothermia. Marcus looked down at the schedule board attached to the rusted shelter. The next public bus wasn't scheduled to arrive for another 55 minutes. And with the escalating blizzard conditions paralyzing the inner-city routes, there was a very high probability it wouldn't come at all. Eleanor Sterling could not survive another hour on this frozen metal bench. She needed immediate warmth, she needed safety, and she needed a way out of this desolate industrial zone. Without a single moment of hesitation, Marcus reached deep into the inside pocket of his damp work jacket. His fingers brushed against the worn, crinkled edges of the single $20 bill resting at the very bottom. He pulled it out, staring at the small piece of green paper in his palm. This was his grandmother Evelyn's grocery budget for the weekend. This $20 was supposed to buy milk, bread, fresh eggs, and oatmeal to keep them sustained until Monday's direct deposit. If he gave this away, he would go home empty-handed to a freezing apartment, and he would have to look into his sick grandmother's eyes and tell her there was no food. The psychological toll of his unearned poverty pressed hard against his ribcage. But he looked down at Eleanor, whose eyes were beginning to flutter closed, her frail body slumping slightly against the iron mesh of the shelter, and the choice became absolute. Dignity costs nothing, but it remembers everything. His mother's voice echoed clearly in his mind. Humanity was not a transaction. It was a duty. "Stay right here, ma'am. Don't close your eyes, okay? I'm going to get you a ride home right now," Marcus said firmly. He stood up, his joints popping from the cold, and ran out into the blinding sheets of freezing rain toward the main avenue. A lone, yellow taxicab was idling at the red light near the corner, its windshield wipers thumping heavily against the glass. The golden available sign on its roof shone like a beacon through the dark storm. Marcus rushed over to the driver's side window, waving his hands urgently to get the man's attention. The taxi driver, a heavy-set middle-aged man with sharp, suspicious eyes, glanced through the wet glass. Seeing a young black man in a oversized, faded work hoodie running toward his vehicle in the dead of night, the driver's immediate reaction was pure, systemic fear. He instantly threw the vehicle into reverse by 3 feet, reached over, and locked all four doors with a loud, metallic click, his face hardening into an expression of absolute hostility. He rolled the window down a mere fraction of an inch, just enough to shout over the wind. "Get away from the car, kid!" The driver barked, his hand resting defensively near the center console. "I don't want any trouble, and I don't pick up passengers from this block after dark. Move along, before I call the precinct." Marcus didn't flinch. He swallowed the familiar sting of the driver's prejudice and kept his hands flat, open, and fully visible against the cold rain, showing he carried no weapon. He pressed his final $20 bill flat against the glass of the driver's window, pointing urgently back toward the broken bus shelter. "Sir, please. I don't need a ride for myself," Marcus shouted, his voice desperate but entirely respectful. "There is an elderly lady stranded in the bus shelter back there. She was mugged, her phone is dead, and she is freezing to death right now. I have $20 cash, right here. It's all I have. Please, just take her to the historic district. Save her life." The taxi driver blinked, his gaze shifting from the green currency pressed against his window to the distant silhouette of the old woman sitting huddled on the bench. Seeing that Marcus was telling the absolute truth and was not an immediate threat, the driver's expression shifted from fear to a cold, opportunistic calculation. He rolled the window down halfway, looking at the crinkled bill with an unbothered smirk. "The historic district is a 4-mile drive through a literal blizzard, kid," the driver said, his voice flat and completely devoid of human sympathy. "With the road conditions and the black ice, my standard meter rate would probably hit $15 anyway. But since it's an emergency and I'm risking my tires out here, I'm not turning on the meter. It's a $20 flat rate. Take it or leave it. Give me the cash first, and I'll put her in the back seat." It was a blatant extortion, a cold-hearted exploitation of a life-or-death situation, but Marcus did not have the luxury to argue or negotiate. He nodded rapidly, slipped the damp $20 bill through the window slot directly into the driver's hand, and rushed back to the shelter. He carefully helped Eleanor stand up, supporting her fragile weight as her legs buckled on the icy sidewalk. He guided her gently across the wet asphalt and opened the heavy rear door of the warm taxicab. As the blast of heated air from the vehicle's vents hit her face, a small sob of pure relief escaped Eleanor's lips. She slid into the vinyl seat, the color slowly beginning to return to her pale cheeks. Before Marcus could close the door, Eleanor reached out with her trembling hand, her fingers catching the rough fabric of his sleeve. Her sharp blue eyes, now clear and brimming with deep emotion, locked onto his face with an intense, unforgettable gratitude. "Young man, you gave away your own money for a stranger," she whispered, her voice shaking, but filled with a sudden, powerful clarity. "Nobody else would even look at me tonight. Please, I must know who you are. Tell me your full name and where you work. I cannot let this night be forgotten." Marcus gave her a quiet, weary smile, his dark face illuminated by the car's interior light. "My name is Marcus Vance, ma'am," he said softly, wiping the freezing rain from his eyes. "And don't worry about the money. You just get home safe to your family. I work down the road at Oak Ridge Logistics. Have a blessed night." He closed the door firmly, and the yellow taxi pulled away into the white abyss of the swirling blizzard, its red taillights slowly fading into the distance. Marcus stood alone on the empty, freezing corner of 4th Street, his wallet completely empty, with a 4-mile walk home through the blinding snow ahead of him on an empty stomach. He was entirely broke, but as he turned his face into the biting wind and began his long journey home, his hand rested against his chest, knowing he had preserved his mother's legacy. He had no idea that within 12 short hours, the name Marcus Vance would become the center of a corporate storm that would shake the city's highest societies to their absolute foundations. The yellow taxicab crossed the invisible boundary separating the industrial gray of the warehouse district from the pristine, snow-dusted brick of the historic district, where Eleanor Sterling's ancestral estate stood like a fortress of unearned wealth. When the car pulled up to the iron gates of Sterling Manor, the driver did not even bother to help the elderly woman out. Eleanor, still shivering but sustained by the vehicle's residual heat, pushed the heavy door open and walked up the sweeping marble steps of her mansion alone. The grandfather clock in the grand foyer chimed 10:30 p.m. as she stepped inside, her wet wool coat dripping muddy water onto the flawless Persian rugs. She had expected warmth. She had expected a frantic family relieved to see her alive after her disappearance. Instead, the moment she entered the sprawling, high-ceilinged drawing room, she was met with a cold, suffocating wave of calculating ambition. Sitting on the velvet sofa, sipping a vintage crystal glass of scotch, was her 26-year-old nephew, Richard Sterling. Next to him sat his wife, Meredith, dressed in a designer winter outfit, her fingers nervously tapping against a leather briefcase. They had not been out searching the freezing streets for their missing matriarch. They had been sitting in the comfort of her heated mansion, waiting for her wealth to fall into their hands. When Richard looked up and saw his aunt standing in the doorway, soaked, disoriented, and visibly exhausted, his face did not register a single trace of familial love or relief. He did not rush to fetch a warm blanket, nor did he ask if she had been harmed by the brutal storm. Instead, a sharp, irritated scowl distorted his features as he stood up, his eyes instantly scanning her person with a predatory focus. "Where on earth have you been, Eleanor?" Richard snapped, his voice entirely devoid of affection, filled only with a harsh, demanding entitlement. "Do you have any idea how irresponsible this is? You disappear for 5 hours during a historic blizzard without your security detail, leaving us stranded here. You are 72 years old, for heaven's sake. You're supposed to be mentally sound, yet you wander off like a senile child." Meredith stood up right behind him, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. She didn't offer a dry towel. Instead, she marched straight up to the elderly woman, her hands reaching out aggressively. With a cold, clinical efficiency, Meredith began to roughly search the pockets of Eleanor's wet wool coat, practically shoving the frail woman backward as she hunted for something specific. "Stop being dramatic, Richard, and help me find the vault keys," Meredith hissed, completely ignoring Eleanor's soft gasp of discomfort as she plunged her hands into the damp fabric. "Look at her. She's completely drenched and incoherent. She probably dropped the master safe keys somewhere on the street. Eleanor, open your eyes. Where is the key to the corporate safe deposit box? You promised to sign the medical power of attorney over to Richard tonight before the board meeting on Monday. You are becoming a legal liability to Sterling Industries with this lump-cum behavior." Eleanor Sterling stood perfectly still in the center of her own drawing room, the freezing water from her hair dripping down her pale face. Her heart ached with a profound, crushing sorrow, but beneath the exhaustion, a cold, piercing clarity began to take root in her mind. She looked at her nephew, the man she had financed, educated, and protected, and saw him for exactly what he was, a vulture waiting for her to die. She remembered what she had told her private attorney, Harrison Vance, just yesterday afternoon. She had grown terrified that the wealth surrounding her had completely poisoned the souls of everyone she knew. She had intentionally slipped away from her security team tonight, leaving her cards and purse behind, embarking on a desperate, silent test to see if there was any true human decency left in a world obsessed with status. Her own flesh and blood had failed the test completely before she even left the house. They hadn't answered her dead phone calls, and now they were robbing her pockets before checking her pulse. But a young black man in a faded hoodie, with absolutely nothing to gain and his last $20 to lose, had looked at her and seen a human being worthy of salvation. "Get your hands off me, Meredith," Eleanor said, her whisper suddenly cutting through the room with the force of a steel blade. Meredith froze, stepping back with a defensive, offended gasp. Richard narrowed his eyes, stepping forward to intimidate his aunt. "Don't take that tone with us, Eleanor. We are the only ones looking out for your interests." You're clearly not fit to manage your own life anymore. We've already called the family lawyer. He's drafting the final declaration of mental incompetence." Eleanor did not answer them. She slowly lifted her left hand, ensuring the massive $200,000 emerald-cut diamond ring caught the light of the chandelier, a silent mockery of their greed. She walked past them without a word, her wet boots leaving a trail of truth across the floor as she headed toward her private study, where Harrison Vance was already waiting in the shadows with a fountain pen and a clean sheet of legal parchment. The trap was set, but it was not for the man who had saved her. It was for the monsters who called her family. The harsh fluorescent lights of the executive boardroom at Oak Ridge Logistics hummed with a menacing intensity on Saturday morning. Marcus Vance stood in the center of the polished concrete floor, his eyes heavy with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He had walked 4 miles through the freezing blizzard the night before, his empty stomach twisting in painful knots, only to arrive home to a freezing apartment where he had to gently lie to his grandmother, telling her he had lost his appetite so she would eat the remaining scraps of bread. He had slept for less than 3 hours before returning to the warehouse for his mandatory weekend inventory check. But the moment he had clocked in, 2 burly private security guards had intercepted him, marching him directly up to the glass offices where Regional Manager Bradley Cooper was waiting. Sitting across from Bradley was Richard Sterling, his tailored wool overcoat draped arrogantly over the back of an executive chair. On the mahogany desk between them lay Marcus's old, weathered canvas backpack, the zipper ripped open, its humble contents strewn carelessly across the table. "Do you know what this is, Vance?" Bradley Cooper asked, his voice low, dangerous, and completely saturated with an unearned, malicious triumph. He reached into Marcus's backpack and pulled out a heavy, gleaming gold Rolex watch, tossing it onto the table where it landed with a loud, metallic clatter. "This is Mr. Sterling's personal luxury timepiece, valued at $24,000. It was reported stolen from his private vehicle in the industrial district last night. And miraculously, my security team just found it buried at the very bottom of your locker during a routine safety sweep." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs in a sudden, violent rush. He froze, his gaze darting from the luxury watch to the sinister, mocking smiles plastered across the faces of Bradley and Richard. The setup was so transparent, so profoundly wicked, that it made his stomach turn. He had never seen that watch in his life. He hadn't even been near a private vehicle last night. "Mr. Cooper, this is a lie," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a raw, controlled fury that made the security guards step closer. "I have never seen that watch before. Someone put that in my locker. I spent my entire night working a 12-hour shift under your nephew's supervision, and then I walked straight to the bus stop on 4th Street. I didn't steal anything." Richard Sterling slowly stood up, leaning his hands flat on the mahogany desk, his face twisting into an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred as he stared at Marcus's dark skin. "Shut your mouth, you lying thug," Richard spat, his voice trembling with a practiced, systemic contempt. "We know exactly what you did last night. You targeted my elderly aunt, Eleanor Sterling, at that bus stop. You saw a vulnerable, wealthy old woman, and you used your intimidating presence to manipulate her, to swindle her, and to steal from our family. You probably lifted this watch right out of my car while your street buddies were distracting her. People like you from the South Side are all the same welfare scams, petty theft, and playing the victim the moment you get caught in real time." Bradley Cooper nodded eagerly, slamming his fist on the desk as he looked at Marcus with utter disgust. "You are officially terminated for gross misconduct and felony theft, effective immediately, Marcus. And because we don't tolerate criminals at Oak Ridge, I am personally calling the state precinct to have you locked away in a federal cell. But Mr. Sterling is a generous man. He's willing to drop the criminal charges under one condition. You sign a full confession right now, you waive your right to your final paycheck, and you swung down on this floor and apologized to him for the stain you've put on this corporation. Marcus stood entirely still, his chest heaving as the sheer weight of the systemic trap tried to crush his spine. They weren't just trying to fire him, they were trying to destroy his entire existence. If he signed a confession, he would have a felony record. He would never work in logistics again. His grandmother would lose her medical insurance, her insulin, and their home within a month. They wanted him on his knees, begging for mercy from the very people who had fabricated a crime to protect their own fragile superiority. But Marcus Vance looked Richard Sterling directly in the eyes, his posture straightening until he looked down on the wealthy heir. His hands did not shake, his voice did not waver. "I will never swung for a lie, and I will never apologize for an act of charity," Marcus said, each word sounding like a hammer striking an anvil. "You can call the police, you can call the governor, but you will never look down on my dignity." Bradley's face flushed, a violent, angry red. "Get this trash out of my building!" he screamed at the security guards. "Pack his rags and throw him into the snow. We'll see how proud you are when the state marshals come for your grandmother's apartment." The guards grabbed Marcus's arms, dragging him brutally out of the glass office, while Richard Sterling let out a satisfied, wicked laugh, entirely convinced he had successfully erased the only man who stood between him and his aunt's multi-million-dollar fortune. The heavy black iron doors of the Sterling legal headquarters loomed over the downtown skyline like a monument to absolute authority. Less than 3 hours had passed since Marcus Vance had been brutally thrown out of Oak Ridge Logistics into the slush of the streets. He had returned to his apartment in a state of quiet, agonizing numbness, wondering how he was going to explain the sudden loss of their livelihood to his grandmother. But before he could even take off his wet boots, a sleek, midnight black luxury town car had pulled up to his crumbling curb. A tall man in a bespoke charcoal suit, identifying himself as Harrison Vance, the chief corporate counsel for Sterling Industries, had stepped out and handed Marcus an official, legally binding corporate summons that required his immediate presence at the penthouse boardroom. The document made it explicitly clear: non-compliance would result in the immediate execution of the grand larceny warrant Bradley Cooper had filed. When Marcus stepped out of the penthouse elevator onto the 32nd floor, the opulence of the room was almost suffocating. The air smelled of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and old money. Sitting around a massive oval boardroom table were Richard Sterling, his wife Meredith, regional manager Bradley Cooper, and a dozen high-ranking corporate board members. The moment Marcus entered in his faded work jacket and damp trousers, the entire room fell into a cruel, expectant silence. Bradley Cooper leaned back, a smug, venomous grin spreading across his face, while Meredith crossed her legs, looking at Marcus with a deep, practiced contempt that made her eyes look like shards of blue ice. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in from the slums," Richard Sterling scoffed loudly, standing up and buttoning his designer suit jacket as he gestured toward Marcus with an arrogant wave of his hand. "The thief actually had the nerve to show up. I suppose you thought you could beg for a settlement, Vance? I told you earlier, your little $20 welfare game is officially over. We are here today to finalize the corporate transition of Sterling Industries, and your presence is required merely so the corporate security team can hand you directly over to the state precinct officers waiting downstairs." Meredith let out a sharp, mocking laugh, her diamonds flashing under the crystal chandeliers. "Did you honestly think an uneducated technician like you could just walk into high society and manipulate an old woman without anyone noticing? You are a stain on this city, and by the time we are done with you today, your family won't even be able to afford the dirt to bury your reputation in." Bradley Cooper chimed in, his voice dripping with sycophantic glee. "I've already signed the termination paperwork, Mr. Sterling. This piece of garbage is completely blacklisted from every logistics firm in the Midwest. He's finished." Marcus stood perfectly still at the far end of the room, his hands resting quietly inside his jacket pockets. He did not look at the security guards lining the walls. He did not look at the racist grins of the corporate executives. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty leather chair at the head of the table. The room was thick with their unearned arrogance, their absolute certainty that they had won, that they had successfully crushed a young black man who dared to stand with dignity against their wealth. Suddenly, the double mahogany doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a loud, authoritative crash. The ambient noise in the room died instantly. Nobody dared to breathe. Eleanor Sterling walked into the penthouse. The frail, disoriented woman from the 4th Street bus stop was completely gone. In her place stood the true matriarch of Sterling Industries. She was dressed in an immaculate, commanding emerald green power suit that tailored perfectly to her frame. Her silver hair was styled with a razor-sharp precision, and her sharp blue eyes blazed with a terrifying, calculated fury that swept across the room like a winter gale. She walked with a firm, unbroken stride, her high heels echoing against the marble border of the room. Behind her walked Harrison Vance, carrying a thick, leather-bound legal folder under his arm. "Eleanor!" Richard cried out, his voice instantly shifting from a venomous snarl to a pathetic, high-pitched sycophancy as he rushed toward her. "Thank goodness you're here! We've captured the criminal who assaulted you last night. Look, he's standing right there. We've already found my stolen Rolex in his locker, and Bradley has fired him. You are completely safe now. We can sign the inheritance papers immediately." Eleanor Sterling stopped dead in her tracks, a mere 2 feet away from her nephew. She did not look at the papers in his hand. She did not look at his desperate, greedy smile. She raised her left hand, the massive $200,000 emerald ring gleaming with a cold, unforgiving light, and delivered a sharp, resounding slap directly across Richard's face. The crack of her palm against his cheek echoed through the vast boardroom like a gunshot. Richard staggered backward, his hand flying to his reddening face, his mouth dropping open in absolute paralyzed shock. The entire room went completely pale. The board members froze in their seats, their pens hovering in midair, a suffocating, terrifying silence, descending upon the penthouse as Eleanor Sterling turned her gaze toward the man who had given her his last $20. The silence that followed the slap was absolute, a suffocating vacuum where the unearned confidence of the room vanished in an instant. Richard Sterling clutched his reddened cheek, his breath catching in his throat as his eyes widened in paralyzed disbelief. Beside him, Meredith's face went entirely pale, her smug expression evaporating into a mask of pure terror. Bradley Cooper sat frozen in his leather chair, his hands hovering over his corporate portfolio as if any sudden movement might draw the lightning down upon his own head. Nobody dared to breathe. The security guards along the walls stood rigid, their eyes fixed straight ahead, recognizing the sudden, dangerous shift in the room's hierarchy. Eleanor Sterling did not offer a single word of explanation to her nephew. She simply turned her back on him with a cold, aristocratic disdain and walked to the head of the mahogany table. She did not sit down. Instead, she rested her fingertips flat on the polished wood, her sharp blue eyes locking onto the corporate board members before shifting toward the large digital projection screen mounted on the wall. "Harrison," Eleanor commanded, her voice slicing through the quiet room with a terrifying crystal clarity. "Activate the security interface for the 4th Street Transit Corridor. Let us review the precise events of last night so that this board can fully understand the nature of the criminal enterprise my nephew has so loudly discovered." Harrison Vance, the chief corporate counsel, nodded once with a grim, tight-lipped satisfaction. He stepped to the podium, tapped his tablet, and the massive screens flared to life, illuminating the dark, rain-slicked concrete of the industrial district from the previous evening. The timestamp on the video read 9:38 p.m. The security footage was captured from a high-definition municipal camera directly overlooking the broken metal bus shelter on 4th Street. The screen clearly showed Eleanor sitting huddled on the frozen iron bench, shivering violently as the blinding sheets of freezing rain lashed against her frail frame. A collective murmur passed through the board members as they witnessed their matriarch in such a desperate, life-threatening state. Suddenly, a sleek, luxury black Mercedes SUV slowed down as it approached the intersection on the screen. The camera zoomed in with a chilling precision, capturing the license plate clearly. Sterling 1. It was Richard's private, corporate vehicle. The video showed the driver's side window rolling down by a mere 2 inches. Inside, the high-resolution lens perfectly illuminated the faces of Richard and Meredith. They weren't looking around for a missing relative. They were staring directly at Eleanor. The footage captured Richard looking at his shivering aunt, letting out a visible scoff of disgust, and immediately rolling the window back up, before stepping on the accelerator. As the luxury vehicle sped away, its rear tires kicked up a massive, dirty wave of freezing black slush that completely drenched the elderly woman. A sharp, collective gasp echoed through the boardroom. Several board members leaned back in their chairs, casting looks of profound horror and disgust at Richard, who was now trembling violently, his hands shaking as he stared at the screen. "As you can all clearly see," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a low, menacing register that made the air in the room feel 20 degrees colder. "My own flesh and blood, the man who sits in my house and demands my fortune, looked directly at me while I was freezing to death and chose to speed away because he assumed I was a nameless street beggar. He did not check his phone. He did not check his conscience. He simply ran from the sight of human suffering." The video continued to play. It showed Marcus Vance entering the frame 3 minutes later. The board watched in complete, humbled silence as the young black man in the faded work hoodie instantly stopped, knelt carefully on the wet concrete in front of the elderly woman, and shielded her from the wind. They watched as Marcus pulled his absolute last $20 bill from his pocket, stared at it for a brief second, and then ran into the blinding storm to secure a taxi. They saw him stand before the hostile driver, press the cash against the glass, and gently guide Eleanor into the warm vehicle, before walking 4 miles home into the dark abyss of the blizzard on an empty stomach. Eleanor turned slowly, her gaze locking onto Bradley Cooper, who looked as though he wanted to sink directly through the floorboards. "And yet," Eleanor whispered, her words echoing like a hammer against an anvil, "this morning, my nephew and this regional manager fabricated a felony theft charge, planted a luxury watch in this young man's locker, and attempted to destroy his entire existence, merely because he possessed the one thing neither of them could ever buy: a soul." Richard opened his mouth, his voice emerging as a desperate, high-pitched shriek. "Eleanor, please! It's a misunderstanding. The security cameras can be manipulated. He's a thug from the South Side. He probably knew who you were. This is a setup to steal our family legacy." "Silence!" Eleanor barked, slamming her hand flat on the table with a force that made the crystal water pitchers rattle. She turned back to Harrison Vance. "Mr. Vance, read the legally binding amendment to my living trust and corporate charter, executed and certified by your office at 2 o'clock this morning." Harrison stepped forward, opening the leather folder. The sound of the crisp paper turning sounded like the tolling of a funeral bell for Richard's future. "By order of Eleanor Sterling, majority shareholder and chairman of Sterling Industries," the attorney read aloud, his voice steady and unyielding. "The individual known as Richard Sterling and his spouse, Meredith Sterling, are officially and permanently disinherited from the Sterling estate. Their trust funds are dissolved, their corporate expense accounts are deactivated, and they are barred from entering any property owned by this conglomerate, effective immediately. Their inheritance is precisely $0. Richard's knees almost gave out completely. He staggered back against the wall, his face the color of wet paper, as Meredith let out a loud, hysterical sob, clutching her designer briefcase as if it could save her from the sudden abyss of financial ruin. But the reckoning had only just begun. The boardroom remained frozen in the wake of the financial execution, the greedy heirs completely stripped of their unearned armor. Richard Sterling looked like a man drowning in dry land. his chest heaving as he stared at his aunt, his mind unable to comprehend that a single, crinkled $20 bill had completely erased his entire life of luxury. But Eleanor Sterling was not finished cleaning her house. Her sharp blue eyes slowly drifted away from her ruined family and settled squarely on regional manager Bradley Cooper. Bradley froze, his hands trembling so hard he had to drop his gold pen onto the table to hide the shaking. The smug, racist sneer he had worn just hours ago in the warehouse office was completely gone, replaced by a cold, dripping sweat that stained the collar of his expensive gray suit. "Mr. Cooper," Eleanor said, her voice entirely flat, professional, and devoid of any mercy. "You stood in your office this morning and told a dedicated 5-year employee that his skin color and his neighborhood meant he belonged under the hum floor, manual labor only. You took his hard-earned promotion and handed it to your incompetent nephew. And then you corporate-sanctioned a fraudulent police report to destroy his life. Tell me, do you believe your pedigree and your tailored suit will protect your career today?" Bradley swallowed hard, his voice emerging as a pathetic, dry rasp. "Mrs. Sterling, I was only trying to protect the corporate image. Mr. Sterling brought the evidence to me. I was misinformed." "You were not misinformed, Mr. Cooper. You were malicious," Eleanor interrupted, her hand gesturing toward Harrison Vance. "As the majority shareholder of Oak Ridge Logistics, I am exercising my corporate veto. You are terminated from your position as regional manager for gross ethical violations, unlawful termination, and systemic corporate misconduct, effective end of business today. Furthermore, I am filing a formal request with the National Logistics Board to have your executive credentials permanently revoked. You will never manage so much as a cardboard box in this industry again." Bradley's face flushed a violent dark purple before draining into a hollow gray. He slowly stood up, his legs shaking beneath him, completely ruined. He had spent his entire career weaponizing his authority against people who looked like Marcus. And now, with a single corporate decree, his name was turned into a permanent black mark in the industry. "And as for you, Richard?" Eleanor turned her piercing gaze back to her nephew, who was still clutching the wall for support. "The security guards standing behind you are not here to arrest Mr. Vance. They are here to escort you and your wife out of this building." Harrison has already forwarded the raw, unedited transit footage and the warehouse locker security logs to the state district attorney. Planting a $24,000 timepiece to fabricate a grand larceny charge is a Class 3 felony corporate fraud. I suggest you find a very cheap public defender, because you no longer have access to my legal team. Richard's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The sheer, crushing reality of his downfall left him entirely paralyzed. The security guards stepped forward, their heavy gloved hands gripping Richard and Meredith's shoulders with a firm, unyielding force. They dragged the disgraced heirs out of the penthouse boardroom, Meredith screaming hysterically about her designer clothes while Richard kept his head cast down in absolute public humiliation. The double mahogany doors closed behind them, and the room fell into a quiet, reverent stillness. Eleanor Sterling took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as the toxic presence of her family was finally cleansed from her legacy. She turned her body fully toward Marcus Vance, who had remained standing quietly at the far end of the table throughout the entire emotional storm, his posture straight, his face an unreadable mask of calm dignity. Eleanor walked down the length of the long table, stopping just inches away from him. She reached into the inside pocket of her emerald suit jacket and pulled out a fresh, crisp legal folder, setting it gently on the dark wood in front of him. "Marcus," she said softly, her eyes warming with a deep, maternal respect that made the entire corporate board look on in silence. "The original position you applied for was Senior Inventory Director at a warehouse that did not deserve your brilliant mind. I would like to officially amend that corporate offer." Marcus looked down at the document. The top line did not read Director. It read Offer of Employment, Vice President of Global Logistics and supply chain operations, Sterling Industries. Underneath, the figures were spelled out in bold, undeniable print. A base salary of $285,000 per year, an immediate 15% controlling equity stake in the manufacturing division, and a corporate sign-on bonus of $100,000 payable within 24 hours. Marcus felt a sudden, heavy warmth rise in his chest, his eyes burning slightly as he read the numbers. This wasn't just a job, it was freedom. It was financial security for his grandmother, Evelyn, for the rest of her natural life. It was the absolute validation of every midnight hour he had spent studying under a dim light while the world told him he was invisible. "Mrs. Sterling," Marcus said quietly, his deep voice thick with emotion, "this is far more than what I earned at the warehouse." Eleanor smiled, a real, beautiful smile that crinkled the edges of her eyes. "You earned this the moment you chose to see a human being instead of a street beggar, Marcus. The world is full of executives who know how to maximize profit. I have a room full of them right here. But I need a leader who understands that human dignity is the most valuable asset a company can ever hold. I can teach supply chain logistics, Marcus, but I cannot teach a man how to have a heart. Welcome to the executive chair." Marcus Vance took a slow breath, reached forward, and picked up the heavy fountain pen resting on the table. With a firm, unbroken hand, he signed his name on the line, cementing a new destiny for his family, completely unaware of how far his single act of kindness would continue to ripple across the city. The transformation of the executive suite on the 32nd floor of Sterling Legal Headquarters happened slow and quiet over the next 18 months, reflecting the steady, unyielding character of its new vice president. Marcus Vance did not use his sudden wealth to purchase flashy cars or high-end designer labels. Instead, his very first executive decision was to move his grandmother Evelyn into a beautiful, sunlit, medical-accessible townhouse in the historic district, where a private nurse oversaw her care, and her long-acting insulin arrived automatically every month without a single worry about insurance copays. The broken radiator on 79th Street became a distant memory, replaced by the peaceful hum of a secure, dignified life. On the grand mahogany desk inside Marcus's new penthouse office, sitting directly next to his high-end computer monitors, was a beautifully framed, velvet-lined glass shadow box. Inside it rested two distinct objects: the original, crinkled $20 bill with the torn edge that Marcus had sacrificed in the rain, and right next to it, the massive $200,000 emerald-cut diamond ring that Eleanor Sterling had worn that fateful night. Eleanor had permanently gifted both items to Marcus on his first day of leadership, stating that the cash represented his character, while the ring represented the blind spot of a world that only respects wealth. It was a constant, silent reminder to every corporate board member who walked into his office that true human value can never be measured by appearance or social class. Under Marcus's visionary leadership, the logistics division of Sterling Industries underwent a radical, unprecedented restructuring. He completely dismantled the biased, nepotistic promotion tracking systems that Bradley Cooper had used to suppress minority workers for decades. Marcus established the Evelyn Vance Emergency Medical Endowment, a $5 million corporate fund dedicated to covering the healthcare, insulin, and housing costs of hourly warehouse technicians and service workers across the entire Midwest. Delay rates in the supply chain dropped by a staggering 34% in his first year alone, as the thousands of workers on the warehouse floors, inspired by a vice president who had stood in their boots, worked with a fierce, unyielding loyalty that no corporate metric could ever force. Forbes named Marcus in its National Next Gen Corporate Leaders Under 30 list, celebrating his innovative logistical algorithms. The consequences for the antagonists of his past came slow, quiet, and completely devastating. Richard and Meredith Sterling, fully disinherited and stripped of the family name, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy within 6 months. Their luxury vehicles and designer furs repossessed by the state to cover their massive, unpayable country club debts. Richard was ultimately convicted of corporate fraud for his attempt to plant the luxury timepiece, receiving a sentence of 3 years of community service and a permanent blacklisting from high society. Bradley Cooper vanished into complete corporate obscurity, his executive license stripped by the National Board, forcing him to take a low-wage, night shift position as a basic security guard at a municipal parking lot on the far edge of the state line. A poetic justice for a man who believed some people were only built for the dark floors. 1 year to the exact night of the historic blizzard, Marcus Vance walked out of the Sterling legal headquarters. He was dressed in a sharp, perfectly tailored navy wool coat that fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. The wind was cold, a light snow beginning to dust the city streets, but his heart was entirely warm. He did not take his executive town car. Instead, he intentionally walked down the sidewalk toward the intersection of 4th and Elm, his boots stepping firmly on the clean pavement. When he arrived at the public bus shelter, he saw that the broken glass panels had been completely replaced by pristine, heated glass shields, funded entirely by his new corporate urban development initiative. Sitting on the bench was a young man in his early 20s, wearing a faded gray college hoodie, his face buried in his hands as a soft, desperate sob escaped his lips. The young man's backpack was torn, and he was staring blankly at a small transit schedule, entirely stranded. Marcus stopped, his mind flashing back to the image of Eleanor, sitting on that very bench 12 months earlier. He stepped inside the heated shelter, his presence calm and commanding. "Everything all right, brother?" Marcus asked gently, his deep voice carrying a warm, familiar resonance through the winter air. The young man looked up, his eyes red and clouded with panic. My mom is having emergency cardiovascular surgery at the downtown clinic in 40 minutes, the boy stammered, wiping a tear from his cheek. "I missed the last transit bus because my shift ran late, and I don't have enough cash for a private ride. I'm going to miss her before she goes under." Marcus did not ask for his background, he did not analyze his pedigree, and he did not care about his status. He reached into his navy coat pocket, pulled out a crisp, fresh $100 bill, and pressed it firmly into the young man's hand, closing the boy's fingers around the paper. "There's an empty yellow cab idling right around the corner," Marcus said with a warm, knowing smile. "Take this, get in the car, and go be with your mother. Don't worry about the change." The young man stared at the money in his palm, then looked up at Marcus in complete, paralyzed astonishment. "Sir, I don't even know your name. How can I ever pay you back for this?" "You don't have to pay me back," Marcus Vance said softly, stepping out of the shelter as the snow fell gently around them. "Just remember that dignity costs nothing, but life always remembers. Someday, when you're in a position to help someone smaller than you, you will." He turned and walked away into the peaceful winter night, his head held high, a black man who had conquered the systemic cruelty of a city through the simple, unyielding power of a single $20 bill. The world had judged him in 3 seconds by his clothes and his skin, but history would remember him forever by his heart. True human dignity can never be measured by the clothes a person wears, the money in their wallet, or the color of their skin. Wealth is a fragile illusion that can vanish in a single corporate hour. But a person's character shines brightest in the dark when nobody is watching. Kindness never asks who is watching, but life always remembers. If Marcus's journey of unyielding integrity moved your heart tonight, please drop a gold heart in the comments below. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in justice today, and subscribe to our channel right now, because Part 2 drops next Friday, revealing Marcus's first international logistics merger and the desperate legal move Richard attempts from the shadows. Good hearts always deserve good endings. We will see you in the next story.